adventure, intrigue, lost cities, ancient mysteries, and more on this week's episode of East10 Investigates. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the East10 Outpost. I'm Cody, and I'm going to be your guide today into a subject that I've wanted to cover ever since starting this channel, but I never felt like I could quite do it justice. Until now. So without further ado, let's take a look at the truth behind the great mysteries of the elongated skull people. Humans are no strangers to using their body as an artistic canvas. Take, for instance, Egyptian mummies that have been found dating to over 2000 BC with tattoos all over their body. Or frozen in the Swiss Alps, we have Otzi the Iceman, who had stretched earlobes that were obviously done intentionally for some sort of expression, and he dates back to over 3,300 years ago. So, what exactly are humans doing? Well, sometimes it's a religious expression or a rite of passage or ceremonial passage, but sometimes it's just mere preference. Today we still get tattoos and gauges, just like ancient Egyptians and ancient Icemen from the Alps. So what is different? Or I guess what trends would be curious or unusual? Well, there definitely are some that have presented themselves throughout history, and arguably the most interesting of those trends would be the elongation of the neck and of the head. Both of those are honestly very unattractive processes, and both are incredibly dangerous. You typically start the process when the human is in infancy, and in the old world, just being an infant was dangerous enough. Birth rates were horrible, and then survival after birth was horrible for the mom and the baby. So why put your very fragile, somewhat rare commodity of a baby through such an excruciating procedure like neck or head elongation? Well, there is some very interesting reasons for that. So let's take a look. Before we take a look at some of these specifics, why they might have practiced such a grotesque and horrific practice, it's important that we spell out exactly how prevalent this practice was throughout the Old World. Examples of it can be found in Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, the Pacific Islands. It can be found in North America, South America, essentially every inhabited continent or island nation that we've exhumed bodies from. The archaeological record bears witness to a robust practice of cranial head binding. And these are amongst cultures that have no academic correlation or connection in many cases. So again, we have to wonder, why was this practice so prevalent, and how did it permeate to so many places, literally every corner of the old world? Well, when we start to look at the art, we get a much clearer picture painted for us. So let's go. No matter the time or the culture you're looking at in the old world, the art generally has a few similarities. One of which is a fascination with the sky and the stars in particular, which is only natural. Prior to there being excessive human light pollution, the night sky was a beautiful and rich tapestry, and basically their only form of movie theater-esque entertainment. Every night you had a fantastic display of brilliantly lit lights in the sky that would move and change their positions. So they were incredibly enamored with the sky, and of course they were. But another similarity we see over and over again is deity veneration. And again, that's a fairly obvious of course. It's natural that they would imagine and depict what they thought was their god or deity, the maker of the framework that they could see in front of them. Humans have always had a desire to put an image, a face to that. But what's interesting, and we see time and time again, is the face that the old world chose to put to that is one of an elongated skull, or an elongated skull with big eyes. We see it over and over again, from cave depictions to medieval art. There was a continued fascination with deities having elongated skulls and above average large eyes. So again, we have to ask, when these cultures were not connected in any way that's academically recognized, why were they all just imagining the same types of deities? Was it just imagination, maybe human similarities? Or was there something maybe a little bit more at play? Well, let's keep diving in, find out. So the practice of cranial deformation just comes down to simple deity veneration, and that's that, right? Well, no, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, especially when looking at things like their art. Because how could so many places interpret their deities the same way, with no connection, no relation, no passing of information or stories? So how could it be? Well, when we look at the archaeological record, an answer may begin to present itself. See, not all of the skulls that have been found show signs of ritual head binding. In fact, some of them appear to be naturally elongated. So, what can we actually infer from that? Well, all of the holy books, no matter what the time or the culture, refers to a time on earth when the gods walked amongst men. Like I say, no matter what the culture, there was always a time period referenced when these deities were very real and physical and walking here amongst us. So if we give any value to the plethora of stories that are out there relaying that same information, and then compare it with the art that exists and compare that with the archaeological record, well, a more unified story begins to present itself. And it seems like, well, maybe there was more to cranial binding than meets the eye. So we'll keep going. Now, we really can't go any further without acknowledging and thanking Brian Forrester, who's an independent researcher that's brought a lot of attention and a lot of really great information to light about these skulls. See, Brian and his team of dedicated archaeologists, anthropologists, and other assorted academics and researchers have been able to uncover a variety of genetic anomalies that really make these skulls pretty darn interesting, and a lot more so than just the cranial head binding explanation we're given over and over again by academics. But I've got to be honest, not everything Brian says is foolproof, and there's definitely some issues with some of his claims. I've been able to talk to a variety of open-minded academics and do my own research, and it definitely seems that while there is some truth and some truly amazing anomalies about these, there's some things that Brian doesn't mention, some context that is scientifically very important to understand when discussing these skulls that we're going to take a look at here. And I'm going to give both sides of the coin, because while they're not exactly what Brian claims, they're also not exactly what academia claims. And either way, I think it's worth taking a better look at. So let's look at each one of the claims individually and discuss what's true and what's not about each one. The first of the genetic anomalies that we'll take a look at is the displaced foramen magnum, which is that hole right there at the base of the skull. Essentially, it's where your neck actually plugs into your head. But for a more scientific definition, we'll refer to Merriam-Webster's for that. It is defined as, quote, the opening in the skull through which the spinal cord passes to become the medulla oblongata. Now, the reason that Brian points out the foramen magnum is because it can't actually be augmented by head binding, and the position of it greatly determines a human or an animal's posture. So, if you had a naturally elongated skull, and it was more voluminous than usual and more heavy, well, our standard human anatomy wouldn't make for a very good host to such a top-heavy skull. So, interestingly, on a lot of the natural samples, the foramen magnum is actually located further back to the end of the skull, which would make sense to distribute that weight more evenly. And again, that can't be augmented through head binding. But what's worth pointing out, and Brian doesn't always, is that the size and the shape of the foramen magnum can actually vary quite a bit in human beings. And we do see a little bit of differential between its location, or it being more round or oval. But why it's still pretty noteworthy is the fact that it can be found consistently in a number of the more anomalous skull samples, like this one here, that pretty clearly don't seem to be head-bound or triangular or coned or narrowed. It seems to be pretty uniform throughout the entirety of the skull. So it is worth pointing out that yes, they can vary in size and shape and placement, but nonetheless, it's found consistently in the samples that were looked at. So yes, maybe it's not completely anomalous in a one-off sense, but when it's being found repeatedly, well, that makes it a little more interesting to look at. But that's far from all. The next genetic mystery we'll take a look at is the missing sagittal suture lines. And if you're not familiar with what a sagittal suture is, well, the dictionary has us covered for that as well. Defined as, quote, the deeply serrated articulation between the two parietal bones in the median plane at the top of the head, end quote. Essentially, it's just where the plates of the skull fuse together on a vertical axis at the back of the skull. There is a second suture line known as the coronal suture, which runs horizontal, and a third known as the metopic suture, which runs vertical at the front of the skull. In many of the examples thought to be naturally elongated skulls, the sagittal suture line is missing completely, and in a lot of the same samples, the coronal suture line is missing as well. And I do want to point out, for the sake of clarity, that I've been able to talk with professionals like Elizabeth Weiss, and she's pointed out to me that over time and as you live your life, your sagittal suture can and might disappear completely. Everybody's skull fuses a little bit different, but generally over time, if you live long enough, the sagittal suture line will disappear entirely, and that can be the same for the other suture lines as well. But why it's interesting is because people of the old world weren't thought to be especially long-lived, but yet we're seeing signs that these people with elongated skulls, what's academically proposed as deformations that were caused physically, somehow those people with all the other adversities of the old world were managing to make it to 60 or 80 years of age. And that's unusual, because we don't actually see that very often in the archaeological record. Lives were much shorter back in the old world because just disease, cleanliness, and things that we take for granted were, completely unknown concepts back then. So while yes, it is possible for a sagittal suture line to disappear over time, when it's found missing from very young specimens, even fetuses in some case, it presents an entirely different argument. And it makes us think that perhaps they're genetically missing, and that would be as a result of formation in the womb. See, if you had a skull that was 1/3 the size of your whole total fetus body, it would have to develop differently. And as such, we see some other curiosities in the fetus examples that we do have, like missing ribs, which would, suggest it was balled up in a much different position. And then the missing sagittal and coronal suture lines suggest that the skull would have formed differently both in the womb and in the immediate time leading after birth. So while it is possible for a suture line to disappear, I think it's very unlikely we would see it so consistently amongst examples and in unborn examples as well. I can't rationalize that. So one of the more compelling arguments for the case of naturally elongated skulls is that they are up to 50% larger in volume than that of a regular Homo sapiens skull. The eye socket is up to 50% larger as well. And what I mean by that is the amount of matter that can actually be held within the cranium or the eye socket is up to twice as big as that of a normal Homo sapiens. But is that true? Well, on a YouTube channel called Stated Casually, I believe that's their name, I'm going to link to them down below, they did actually a pretty good job testing this claim out. And with the sample that they had, which was an exact replica of a real paracas skull, one that Brian Forrester himself frequently points to as a naturally elongated one, they tested it with dough, and they filled the eye socket to see which one bulged more, on a elongated skull or on the normal skull. And interestingly enough, it was actually more shallow on a elongated skull than on a regular human skull. And scientists have tested this claim as well by pouring beans in and a number of other ways that they can actually test how much can fit inside the cranium of a naturally elongated skull versus that of a normal human's. But I think one thing is critical to point out, and it's the fact that one was tested out of thousands of samples in paracas alone, let alone found all around the world. So while one sample may have shown that cranial head binding actually pulls the eye socket back, causing it to be more narrow, something that Brian points out, and it actually makes the depth of it more shallow, I think that's true and can definitely be the case, but is it always the case? Well, more testing would need to be done and should be done to definitively answer that one way or the other, because certainly just by looking at these, they do seem twice as big as a regular skull, but looks can be deceptive. So the jury's still out on this one as far as I'm concerned, but it's a compelling argument nonetheless. Another of the more compelling pieces of evidence in favor of naturally elongated skulls is the presence of what's called an Inca bone. Now, as the name would suggest, it is found prevalently throughout the Incan royal bloodline, but it's also found in the paracas elongated skulls, the ones thought to be natural and pointed out to be such by Brian Forrester and other researchers that have taken a look at these. But what's interesting about it and why it's worth pointing out is the paracas culture predates the Inca Empire. So it's very likely and possible that the royal paracas people, having naturally elongated skulls and carrying this trait, were part of the beginning of the Inca Empire and probably genetically contributed to it in some way, because we see the trait continue and persist throughout the royal bloodline. Another interesting trait that's found consistently throughout the naturally elongated skull samples is what's referred to as foramen, like the foramen magnum that we discussed down here. But these are smaller ones, and they're found naturally on regular human skulls in various places. But on the what's thought to be naturally elongated ones, they're found very curiously in spots different to where we would find them in a normal Homo sapiens skull. And the implication would be it's supplying blood flow and potentially tissues or muscle to different parts of the head that would need it due to the increased size. So those two are very distinctly genetic traits that can't be manipulated through any form of head binding, and something that even if we still see naturally occurring in skulls today, should be thought of perhaps as more of a genetic holdover than established as normal. These traits came from somewhere, and in today's day and age, we are a giant genetic melting pot. So it shouldn't be strange necessarily to consider them showing up from time to time still in populations today. Because these people reproduced, they had bloodlines, and those bloodlines presumably ended up somewhere. So I don't think the fact that they exist in regular skulls should at all discount the fact that they are located consistently in certain places over and over and over again in these paracas skull samples. And it's another thing I think with further testing might reveal a much wider sample of skulls that have that consistent trait. So these are just a couple of many anomalous differences about the naturally elongated skulls versus that of a regular Homo sapiens or that of a regular skull that's been through ritual head binding. And in a future video, we'll look at more of the genetic oddities that can be found with the supposed naturally elongated skulls. But just with what we've discussed today, it begs the question, why has academia not more seriously taken a look at these? It's plain for all with eyes to see something else is going on besides just ritual head binding. And whether or not all of Brian's claims are true, that shouldn't matter, because he's not actually an academic. He's going about things in a very scientific and proper way, and I really give him his dues. But at the end of the day, he's just an independent researcher, and it's up to colleges and professional academics to actually get involved, actually test these samples, put his claims to the test, and definitively confirm or deny them. I see a lot of armchair quarterbacks on X and on other social medias poking fun at the work Brian has done or trying to devalue it in certain ways. And I don't think that's very fair if they're not willing to get hands-on themselves and figure out what exactly is or isn't going on with these. Well, all in all, I find the case for naturally elongated skull people to be pretty darn compelling. I think that there's more than enough physical and circumstantial evidence to suggest that there might be something else going on here besides cranial head binding. And I think it definitely deserves a modern, robust, and thorough look by academia into whether or not some of these were natural, or if literally every single example that we find in the archaeological record is the result of a ritual head binding. So until we can actually have these questions satisfactorily answered, we need to turn to people like Brian Forrester that are the only ones actually doing the work. So I would encourage you to check him out and support him directly, because the work he's doing, whether or not you agree with his findings or how he's handled it, it's impressive that he's actually doing work and actually trying to get to the bottom of this very mysterious well. So, like I say, support Brian if you get the chance. I'll put some links down in the description below. And if you enjoyed this topic, I actually wrote about it in Pharaohs, a magazine published by the Institute for Natural Philosophy. I'll link to that down in the description below as well. But stay tuned, because in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the genetic research Brian has done into these elongated skulls and what the results show, because the insinuations of it are very interesting, to say the least. So, like, subscribe, follow along, and all that good stuff so you don't miss that upload when it happens. But in the meantime, my friends, be indomitable in your quest for knowledge, and above all, stay curious, my friends.